Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to General Misconduct. This is part 2 of a 2-part series on General Douglas MacArthur. If you haven't already listened to episode 1, make sure you go ahead and listen to that before you listen to this episode, just so you're all caught up to where we're at. I want to thank everybody for supporting the podcast, listening to last week's episodes. The numbers that I've seen have been a lot better than I was expecting, so thank you all for listening, downloading, supporting the podcast. Really appreciate it. But without further ado, let's get into today's episode. And we're going to pick up right where we left off last time with Doug MacArthur's escape from the Philippines. So, to set the scene, get caught up to where we were, it is mid-March 1942. The Japanese are hitting Bataan hard, and it looks like if Doug doesn't leave the Philippines, he's going to get captured by the Japanese eventually. This causes a lot of concern in Washington because Doug MacArthur has become something of a celebrity and this kind of uniting figure for the American people. They'd basically chosen him in the American press to be this kind of hero, which the U.S. needed at the time, especially in early 1942. Really, all of the Allies needed it, with the Nazis, pushing through into Russia, Pearl Harbor happening, all these Japanese victories in the Far East. Wasn't looking too good for the Allies, and all of a sudden, this guy who was already pretty famous, pretty popular, all of a sudden he kind of rises up as this hero that the American people could rally around. And so DC kind of recognizes that, hey, we need to get MacArthur out of there. So they send him a telegram basically saying, hey, you need to leave Corregidor, head south to Australia. But they decide to leave it up to him when he wants to leave. So by mid-March, he decides, all right, let's get out of here. He boards a wooden PT boat, which is a torpedo patrol boat, and heads south towards Australia, dodging the Japanese Navy all along the way. At one point, he comes within 7 miles in visual range of a Japanese cruiser. Luckily, the Japanese never spot him. He makes it to Australia. From there, he boards a B-17 and flies all the way across the continent down to the south and gets on a train and goes to set up his new headquarters in Australia. When he arrives in Australia, he's greeted by a large press corps. They're asking him all these different questions about what he intends to do as far as the war goes. And this is when he makes his famous remarks about, I shall return to the Philippines. That's a paraphrase, but that just becomes this whole mantra for Mac, is that I shall return. Basically, his whole goal for the rest of the war is getting revenge on the Japanese, taking back his beloved Philippines, and getting retribution for his failures at Bataan. Despite those failures at Bataan, he will be awarded the Medal of Honor for his defense of the Philippines. Now, this comes more so from the pressure of the American people due to his elevation to this kind of hero status that he's achieved. And it's not entirely unearned. It does seem odd based on what we now know about MacArthur and his decision to pull back to Bataan. But we have to also understand that the American defenses there hold out for far longer than anyone intended them to. By the time the Americans end up surrendering in May of 1942, the men were down to a quarter amount of rations. So they had basically ran out of everything by the time they end up surrendering. They don't have any food, they don't have any ammunition. They held out for literally as long as they humanly could, which was twice as long as the Japanese thought they were going to hold out for. The Japanese army, for perspective, were given orders to take Bataan within 60 days from the initial assault, and it ends up taking them over 120 days. And so because of how well the defenses actually do hold at Bataan, despite them eventually having to surrender, Washington decides to give MacArthur the Medal of Honor. This is actually something that General George Marshall, who was the chief of staff at the time, if you remember, he ends up putting that recommendation forward, and they end up giving it to MacArthur, which is presented to him on March 26th at a dinner reception in Australia with the Prime Minister of Australia. He actually presents the award. That's going to be Prime Minister John Curtin, who is going to be a very close, not necessarily ally of MacArthur, sort of a quasi-puppet to an extent. MacArthur ends up exerting a lot more kind of influence over Curtin than he does over MacArthur. And this is kind of the beginning of MacArthur sort of serving as a quasi-military dictator of Australia. Not as far as much as he was in the Philippines during the late 30s, early 40s, and not nearly as much to the extent as he will be in Japan after World War II. But nevertheless, that's basically the position that he's in, because he's basically put in charge in the entire defense of the continent of Australia. Because by this time, he's been elevated to commander basically of all ground forces that were left in the Far East, which was basically what was on the continent of Australia, which wasn't much. You have to understand that prior to Mac getting to Australia, or really prior to the Japanese attacks on Pearl Harbor and the invasions into the South Pacific, the Australian forces and the New Zealand forces were occupied with the war in Europe and the war in North Africa. They had been serving in Iraq and Iran during the British occupations there, fighting the Nazis, like I said, in North Africa, defending Egypt, and some of them were even as far as Great Britain in helping with the Home Island defense. So there wasn't really a lot of forces left on the continent for Mac to take control of. I think the only organized force that the Australians had left as far as ground forces went was they had a single division. They had some other kind of scant forces here and there, but it never numbered more than around 20,000 men, which is not a lot when you're intending to defend an entire continent. On top of that, though, there was a small American force which numbered about 25,000 that either followed Mac from the southern Philippines or came from Hawaii, whatever the Americans could pull from in order to help with the defense of Australia. And the defense of Australia becomes the primary objective for Doug MacArthur starting in March of 1942. And this is going to be what he's going to be occupied with basically for the rest of the year. The first part of this is a debate on how he should defend Australia. There's basically two prevailing ideas for how he should do this. His original idea is establishing what would be known as the Brisbane Line. With this strategy, basically he wanted to pull all the forces on the continent and then keep them on the continent and put them in strategic positions to defend important port cities, including Darwin in the north, Sydney farther in the east, but more so focusing on the western parts of the country and the northern parts of the country, where the Japanese were most likely going to invade if they were going to invade, which, whether or not that was likely or not, is up for debate. The other strategic idea was that you push the forces off the continent and you put them in places like Papua New Guinea, which is at the time was considered part of Australia. You put them in the Solomon Islands to the north, and what you do there is that forward defense prevents the Japanese from flanking you in the east and cutting off the supply lines from Hawaii to Australia, which at that time was basically the only way any new supplies or troops was getting through to Australia was from Hawaii. So at first, like I said, Doug's going to take that stance of the Brisbane Line being what he's going to go with. Eventually, he ends up changing his mind and he goes with the second option. However, because it's not MacArthur's original idea, he has to kind of rewrite the history of it all. And eventually, what he's going to do for years to come is he's going to say, "Oh, the Brisbane Line idea, that was never my strategy. My idea was to always put men in the Solomon Islands or on Papua New Guinea. And the Australians wanted to keep the forces on the continent," which wasn't true. Pretty much anybody in Australia wanted the forces pushed out further because that ran less of a risk of the Japanese landing on the continent. Nevertheless, this is where the New Guinea campaign begins. Now, the New Guinea campaign is really going to take up most of the war for MacArthur. It begins with the, like I said, the idea of the defense of Australia in kind of mid-1942, and that campaign's going to run all the way up through 1944. And it's going to be marked with a lot of typical MacArthur episodes, including the removal as Air Force Chief. He's going to be replaced by a guy named George Kenney. That guy's going to have a lot of influence on MacArthur. We're going to meet a lot of different characters that serve either with MacArthur, under MacArthur, on his staff. And you're going to have like 3 different type of characters who end up interacting with him. You're going to have your typical, ego strokers who don't really have much to offer, but they know how to sweet talk MacArthur. You have guys who can convince MacArthur of good ideas. They know how to stroke the ego when it needs to be, but also can present him with new ideas and convince him of those ideas. The key, mostly with those guys, is they know that they have to make it seem like MacArthur came up with it. George Kenney is going to do that to a T with how the Army Air Corps is going to be ran in the Pacific. And then the last one are going to be MacArthur rivals. These are guys who will serve under MacArthur or adjacent to him. And these are guys either directly or indirectly compete with MacArthur. And we're going to see quite a few different characters who end up doing that. Some of them, guys like Admiral King, Admiral Nimitz, they're not going to have to worry about a thing because they don't serve under him. A couple of guys, though, are going to incite the wrath of MacArthur, not because they, defied him or intended to do any kind of harm to his dignity or anything like that, but because they end up winning the adulation of the U.S. press, which we're going to, as we've discussed, MacArthur has this big ego, and once the press really starts picking up on him and choosing him as their hero, he's going to want to stay in that spotlight, and he does not want to share it with anyone. Anyway, as I was saying, the New Guinea campaign is going to be marked with a lot of these kinds of episodes. He's going to have repeated head knockings with the Navy, specifically with Admiral King, on how the war is going to be ran, because the Pacific campaign, there's a lot of water, it's a lot of islands, so the Navy has to play a major role in that. And there's going to be these conflicting kind of like commands, because MacArthur is obviously in charge of ground forces. He's going to want to be in control of naval forces at the same time because they're operating in his area. So you're going to have a lot of these issues where Mac's going to go head-to-head with the Navy, and it's really going to feed into his dislike for the Navy, which is already something that he's had for quite a few years. Dates back prior to World War II, and it's not something that is specific to MacArthur. If you study military history at all, and you study, the Army and the Navy in the U.S., in Japan, in most countries, there's always this rivalry between Army commands and naval commands, and it's going to be exasperated in the Pacific. Specifically, he's going to run into a lot of issues with Admiral King, like I said, who at the time of the beginning of the New Guinea campaign, King was dealing with the Battle of Guadalcanal, and that's going to kind of bring some spotlight on King and the Navy and the Marines, their operations there. There's going to be a lot more press focused on those guys. It's going to take away from Doug's spotlight. He's not going to like that. He's going to lay a lot of heat on his field commanders, who actually do a decent job in New Guinea. And then he's going to have a lot of brushes with Chief of Staff George Marshall. And that's actually something that's going to play later in the Korean War, when George Marshall is going to serve as Secretary of Defense while Doug is Supreme Commander of UN forces. So you can kind of see the groundwork for later, really Doug's dismissal. You can see the kind of groundwork being laid as early as 1942. Another thing that starts to happen around this time is Doug starts publishing these communiques, which are like battlefield report, kind of like press releases on how his troops are doing. And he would send out these reports regularly to the press, and they weren't grounded in reality at all. And he always made sure that the situation always appeared better than it was, that his forces were decimating the Japanese, that